All right, Governor.
Hey.
Thanks for coming in, Governor Malloy. I appreciate it very much having this opportunity to talk about your time in office.
Sure. Happy to do it.
I wanted to start off looking back 8 years. How did the reality of being governor compare perhaps with the perceptions you had in running for the office?
Oh, I think I was pretty well prepared to be governor, having been mayor of a city for 14 years and strong mayor form of government, chief executive of the city. So I don't think I was surprised by anything. I think disappointed in some senses that people say they want change, but then you show them what change is, and then they're no longer sure that they want it. And then when it's exercised, sometimes they decide they like it, and in politics they take credit for it.
So that you found that more of a challenge, taking it to a statewide level as opposed to.
Well, yeah, no, it's a bigger operation. Now, listen, I ran a government for 25,000 people, and then you get elected governor, and you're running a government for 3.6 million people, plus a lot of folks who come in and out of your state every day. So it's a different scale, but I don't think that there were. I wasn't shocked by anything. The amount of time on healthcare and hospital issues, I think, probably exceeded any expectation. So maybe that's an area where this coming together of Obamacare's implementation plus decisions that have been made by my predecessors came head to head with the economic realities of Connecticut's difficulties and ate up a lot of time.
Now, when you were first elected in 2010, the state faced a true fiscal crisis. Legislature borrowed heavily just to keep the lights on, keep things operating. The pension funds have been grossly underfunded. And you were coming out of a great recession, and Connecticut had kind of lagged behind, and so the recession was still certainly a drag on Connecticut. So with the legislature responded with a combination of economic incentives, try to get the economy going with spending cuts and with substantial tax increases. Yet the fiscal and economic struggles continued throughout your two terms, I would argue. Mm-hmm. In retrospect, in the hindsight of what's happened since, was anything you would have done differently from how you approached that crisis entering office?
Sure. I would have hoped that proposals that we made would have been adopted. I think that being governor of a state with a legislature that had become very used to playing I would argue, an outsized role, led to real difficulties in having people come to grips with the realities of the situation that in some cases they had placed the state in. Being the first and only governor to fully fund the pension obligation shouldn't have fallen to me. And it shouldn't have fallen to the legislature while I was governor. But we took that issue on, and it's made a real difference. The failure of the legislature, for instance, to do in the last biennium budget the things necessary to put the teacher's pension plan in the same shape that we've done with respect to the state pension plan is a disappointment. And they know they need to do something, but they refused to do it. And I think that was a great failure. That was a great bipartisan failure. Republicans gave Democrats an excuse not to do anything.
Going back to,
or not to do. I shouldn't say not to do anything, because in fact, rather than doing what had been proposed doing, they did increase the contribution by the teachers by 1%, but it doesn't address what is lingering out there, and that is this potential of a very great obligation falling to the taxpayers of the state of Connecticut when that could be avoided.
going back to entering office and that first fiscal relief plan, were your expectations then that enough was being done that you'd start to see a substantial turnaround, and by the end of your first term, Connecticut would be substantially moving in a better direction? Or did you realize that the situation is so serious and the ability to only get so much from the legislature would mean that this would be a prolonged challenge you would be facing?
I don't think. I mean, I think people in Connecticut tend to think of Connecticut onto itself as opposed to being caught up in national trends. The reality is that this is the slowest recovery of any recovery in our nation's modern history. So, although we were always conservative in our expectations with respect to revenues, for instance, as opposed to other states in the immediate area, such as New Jersey, even those conservative expectations weren't necessarily met on a year-to-year basis. People forget that the second half of 2011, we actually saw a downturn economically in the United States. People forget how deeply Connecticut had been impacted. And they also forget things like major employers retooling for other product lines. And that would be particularly true of Pratt & Whitney engines. So, people say, well, the state's GDP has not recovered in a robust way. Well, a lot of that time of that retooling was slower sales taking place as new factories or revised factories were being constructed and put into use. So there are ebbs and flows, and we had to deal with those.
I recall, I think it was your first address to the legislature, you promised to invoke GAAP, the generally accepted accounting principles. It got maybe one of the loudest applause of the speech, which might be a first in political history that an accounting firm got cheered. Did you ever get there? Do we have?
Yeah, we're GAAP compliant. Absolutely, we're GAAP compliant. So much so that if we were accounting the way that my predecessors accounted, what everyone talks about as a deficit wouldn't be recognized. So we're GAAP. Not only did I have that in my speech, I signed an executive order making us GAAP compliant on the day I was sworn into office, and subsequently got the legislature to enact it into statute. And quite frankly, that was a very important tool to use in a political sense with the legislature, who, quite frankly, would be more than happy to be non-GAAP compliant, because it certainly had allowed lots of fun things for people to do, spend money that they didn't have.
Could you explain briefly to readers why GAAP was important and why it makes for a more honest budget, but politically more difficult?
Well, GAAP are standards that are established by a independent body of CPAs, and they make the rules on how entities should report their outcomes, whether it's revenue, whether it's expenditures, and it certainly pertains to long-term obligations. Not being compliant, not requiring government to be compliant with GAAP prior to my becoming governor, allowed legislators, the legislature, to play games with expected income. Perhaps in some ways not unlike what GE is now facing in an investigation on their accounting practices. So what GE did is to assume future profits and take them as profits in a year in which they weren't paid in. Well, government was doing a lot of things like that and pushing off obligations that they had, most particularly with respect to pension obligations and other post-employment obligations, such as health insurance.
Do you take any, I would say pleasure out of, it's probably too strong a word, but how do you view GE's trouble, given that you took so much heat for allowing this great company at the time, as it was characterized, leave Connecticut? That sort of fell on your watch, the blame for that.
Well, we kept the good parts of GE. Synchrony is a Fortune 500 company spun off from GE that has 450 jobs in Connecticut. When we entered into our transaction with them, I think they had about 100. We kept a lot of the good parts. GE was badly run for a long period of time, and the idea that Boston paid $140 million for the number of jobs that they got out of the deal is really quite amazing. Their stock, as of this morning, was $7.19 a share, down 60% this year alone, but they were also down, 40% the year before. Announcing leaving Connecticut didn't work out too well for them. Do I take any solace in that? No. I think, in point of fact, what was happening was, I think the executives of the company were trying to hide how poorly they had done in running the company, and talking about making it into a computer company or a technology company fit their reasoning and what they tried to do. But people have been badly hurt by what happened to GE. Many retirees who depended on dividends. Many investment funds, have been really badly shaken by that, and how it will play out in the future is unknown. They probably should have been paying more attention to running the company than they had.
I want to talk about some of the accomplishments of your administration, and I'm sure you'll have more to add, but 125,000 jobs added
since the end of the recession.
Since the recession,
right.
Net increase of Fortune 500 companies from 11 to 17, according to your administration.
No one knows that in Connecticut.
30% reduction in state workers in the executive branch. Rebuilt the rainy day fund. It's flush right now.
Well, actually, we've had a rainy day fund since my first year in office, since the end of my first year in office. People forget that.
Right.
There was no money in the rainy day fund. My predecessor had borrowed in excess of $900 million to maintain operations, and there was a plan for whoever became governor, and I became governor, to borrow another $1 billion. I didn't do that. And I paid off almost $1 billion that my predecessor had borrowed. And that was on top of taking all what was called ARA, but the supplemental federal funds that were made available to the state, and using that to sustain present operations, which, quite frankly, probably violated some rules, but they got away with it.
You've made progress on closing the gap in the underfunded pensions. You've been paying the obligation since you've been elected. The legislature has been, and you've been citing those budgets. Crime is down.
Yeah.
Passage of some tough gun laws were passed in the state. Yet your approval ratings are abysmal. So, how do you politically look at this? What do you attribute that disconnect where you think you point to a record of success? But
I wasn't looking to be popular. I was looking to make change. And
so why was change unpopular? Usually you think change and achievement would be popular.
Because no one had ever paid the pensions. So no one had to do that. Of course, it would have bankrupted the state to continue down that road, and that would have violated generally accepted accounting principles. And so when taxes needed to be raised to make sure that we put the state's long-term fiscal health on a better track, that makes you unpopular. But it was the right thing to do, I don't think people understood how bad the state was, what kind of shape the state was at the end of my predecessor's term. I knew how bad it was. I'd been talking about generally accepted accounting principles for, 6 years before that on a statewide basis. By the way, the state required all municipalities to live by GAAP, but it didn't require itself to live by GAAP. These were important things to get done. Crime at a better than 50-year low, and the most dramatic decreases in violent crime of any state in the nation is very important. But if you're not a victim of a crime, or even if you are, the statistics aren't the things that people will make judgments on. And so I think that the reality is my administration paid a very deep price for doing the right thing on a long-term systemic basis, of putting the state's house in order. And that required some tough discussions in other areas too. Teachers weren't happy when we pointed out that we'd had 5 years declining graduation rates before I came into office, and that we needed to change the road we were going down on an educational basis, particularly since the losers were primarily black, brown, and poor kids. And so here we are, in my 8th year with documented 7 years of increased graduation rates to the highest we've ever had, substantially greater than the national average. And quite frankly, those degrees mean more today than they did when I came into office, because there's more to demonstrate testing-wise that those degrees have value. But you had to have some fights to get that done. But the idea that I came into office desiring to be popular is a mischaracterization of what I devoted my public service to.
Do you think you could have been reelected if you chosen to run for a third term and had a chance to defend that record?
I was never going to run for a third term. I didn't think I was going to have a second term. Quite frankly.
Why is that? Because of all the reasons you just stated?
Yeah, because of all the reasons I just stated. Doing the tough work of recasting Connecticut, not on a short-term basis, but a long-term basis, was hard work. And nobody was more surprised that I got reelected than me.
Kind of what the editorial board sort of considers a black mark, and I'm going to give you a chance talking about that 2014 election, since that's where we're at right now. You participated in the public campaign financing,
yeah.
$6.5 million for the general election, as you did in your first run for office. I think you were the first gubernatorial candidate to do so. And the intent of the program is to keep special interest money out of the campaign. However, the Democratic Party, using the federal rules, solicited donations from state contractors that would not have been allowed to come in to the process under state election laws. And some of that money helped you get reelected. And the Democrats agreed to settle this when the State Election Enforcement Commission opened an investigation with a $325,000 payment. So the question is, did you do a little cheating to get elected in 2014?
No, not at all. There was no cheating, and quite frankly, you need to put it in the context of the Republicans did exactly the same thing. If there was a mistake made, it was not filing the same complaint against Republicans in that context. But the real problem is, and still is, that although we came up with a vehicle for publicly funded campaigns, on the national level, the a federal court, Supreme Court decision makes it impossible to do, to the extent that a normal person who's not wealthy could be competitive in such a race. So no, I don't think that there was. I think that the reality is that people need to abide by the law, and people did abide by the law. There was charges made and a settlement entered into, but the reality is it had nothing to do with changing the results. In both my first and second run, in my second and third runs, I ran against someone who was self-funded. And we were far outspent, both in the first successful election and the second successful election. Now that was made possible because rules after Connecticut adopted its rules were changed in a Supreme Court decision.
Do you think the Citizens Election Program, at least as far as considering the governor's race, is really cannot live up to its ideals given Citizens United decision and the ability of all this outside money to come into the campaign, that you take the public financing, you're at a great disadvantage?
Well, let's put it in perspective. The Republicans in the last 3 elections have run self-funders for governor. And the Democrat who won this time was also a self-funder. So I think that there are difficulties associated with the program, and that may be something the legislature will or will not tackle in the future.
Where could they go with it potentially?
In light of some very bizarre court decisions that say that foreign companies have a right to spend money to sway elections in the United States. If that's the standard, I don't know how you come up with the perfect program.
Can we talk about Second Chance?
Sure.
Your Second Chance program to try to divert more, particularly young people, from a prison system into programs that could help them lead productive lives, provided incentives for prisoners to get into training programs with the same goal that when they get out of prison, they can be successful in reintegrating back into communities. And during this debate, you pointed out the racial disparities that exist in our criminal justice system, and you were criticized for playing the race card or bringing racism into it. So I was wondering if you could talk about the Second Chance initiatives that you pushed the legislature to enact, and that kind of criticism you faced at the time.
We shouldn't be surprised that white people get offended when race gets raised. On the other hand, it needs to be done. I mean, what you're specifically referencing was a law that Connecticut had and other states had that said if you just possessed drugs within 1,500 feet of a school and certain other facilities, that you could be charged with a felony, and that you would have a minimum 2-year sentence. Well, if you live in a community where every part of the community is within 1,500 feet of one of those designated structures, and we have communities like that. In fact, we're sitting in one right now in New London. Don't be surprised that more black and brown people go to jail for drug possession or take pleas because they're facing potentially a felony, and in some cases may have taken pleas for things that they should not have pled to. And so how do you have a discussion about a law that is having disparate impacts unfairly without raising the racial disparity? I've never been shy about that. I don't, I understand why the law got passed. People got nervous about drugs, and I don't think that they passed that law taking into consideration what would be the disparate impact on a black, brown, or community of poverty. But once we knew what it was, then we had an obligation to address it. I'm actually pretty proud that we addressed it the way we did. What you have to understand is, Connecticut in a very short period of time, perhaps as little as 24 months, will be the first state in the nation to halve its prison population. And the prison population has dropped by over 5,000 people while I've been governor. We're saving tens of millions of dollars every single year as a result. Crime is lower, recidivism is down. Violent crime had the lowest drop of any state over a 4-year period of time. That's a pretty good track record while we did things like decriminalizing marijuana. That's first year. We did that. Why was that important? Because we knew that there was a racial disparate impact an urban impact on black and brown and kids in poverty who were using up programs that really didn't make any sense to be using up in case they made another mistake sometime in their life. That might be available to them to get them from an age to an age where you don't do quite as many stupid things. And by the way, when we decriminalized marijuana, we instantly had 8,000 fewer cases to be processed in our court system, meaning that prosecutors could put more effort in violent crime than in things like marijuana possession, which, quite frankly, I'm not is a ubiquitous substance in America today. So we started on day one on Second Chance. We got more vocal about it as we started to have more successes. And as we found more and more allies, and there are some great folks who have come forward to employ people who come out of prison. And what have they found? They have found that by giving someone a chance in that context, they get a very loyal, hardworking individual working for them that will never forget the chance that they were given.
Mm-hmm. And that approach
Bear's Barbecue, by the way, in the greater Hartford area is one of those.
And that approach has gained more popularity. That approach nationally, trying to.
I'm very popular out of state.
But I mean, we just had Congress. It's going to be introduced in Congress at the federal level. Some reforms and such.
Yeah, well, Connecticut has pushed the envelope on criminal justice reform. We are the leader on a national basis. As a state, we are the lead state in criminal justice and corrections reform. Period. And that is known and it is appreciated. Anyone who's connected with those issues in the nation knows about our success, and they point to it on a regular basis. And most people in Connecticut ignore it on a regular basis. But so be it. What's important to me is that people are safer. We're saving money. People are coming out of prison and getting more jobs than they did in the past, which lowers the recidivism rate. And recidivism is someone comes out of jail and goes back to jail in a short period of time. Those are important things to do.
Yet there'll always be that 1 or 2 or 3 cases in which someone, given these opportunities, goes and does something heinous, and the entire underpinning gets attacked and such.
Right, and most governors fold, and I don't. The accusations about crime going up were always lies in Connecticut. The accusations that people were getting out of jail early just isn't true. Violent criminals do more time while I've been governor than they did at any time in the past. That's the reality. But we shouldn't be sending as many people to prison for things that could be treated by alcohol help, or drug help, or mental health help, or treating children's traumas so that they don't act out in ways that ultimately lead to their incarceration. There's just better ways to do these things, and there's better ways to pay to spend our dollars, and better things to spend our dollars on.
Were you most motivated by the fairness of it, or the financial advantages, or did you like the fact that those kind of came together on this initiative?
Well, I grew up in the civil rights era, and it had a tremendous impact on who I am and what I am and how I think about things. And I'm also a former prosecutor who saw firsthand how things played out. And I think one of the great drivers in what I've attempted to do in criminal justice reform is to set a 300-year, 400-year history in our country, going back to slavery, that has had disparate impacts. Some of those intended and some of those unintended. We have to look ourselves. I have to look myself in the mirror every day when I shave, and I'm proud of what I've done with respect to leveling the playing field in Connecticut, and seeing that poor people don't always get the short end of the stick, that black people don't always get the short end of the stick, that brown people don't always get the short end of the stick, because we as white people don't want to examine what we've done. So that's probably more of my motivation. Plus, I know it's the right thing, that it will lead to lower crime, that it will lead to people being safer. It has led to people being safer. There are tens of thousands of individuals who have not been the victim of a crime in Connecticut because I became governor and because we implemented a second chance society, partially.
One of the achievements of your administration, though it depends on your perspective, I guess, on the issue, is the repeal of the death penalty.
Yes.
But there was a caveat when the law was passed, and it's that people who were already on death row would be punished, would be executed, and ultimately the state Supreme Court struck that down. Andrew McDonald, the justice you appointed, wrote that decision, I believe.
No,
I'm wrong on that.
You're wrong on that.
But he did
not write the decision.
But it was a one-vote decision, so his vote was pivotal.
Which no one should have been surprised at, because he'd advocated the end of the death penalty throughout his political career as chairman of the Judiciary Committee.
Honestly, did you think in signing that law that anyone would again be executed, with the legislature having voted to repeal the death penalty? It seemed rather shaky legally.
I don't. The reason I didn't believe anyone would ever be executed in Connecticut is that no one had ever been executed in Connecticut since the 1950s, save one person who volunteered. We don't have a workable system. Never did since the 1950s on. There's only one person Connecticut put to death, and he volunteered for it. Having said that, this is I believe it's not the right thing to do. I mean, I believe that on a moral basis, I suppose I believe what the Catholic Church believes, that it's immoral to put people to death.
You signed a law that at least technically still would have put people to death. I mean, was that a political compromise, given passions, particularly over the Cheshire murders, Dr. Pettit's family, that you realized the votes would not be there if that exception was not included in the law?
Let's be very clear. If I thought we could have done away with the death penalty without compromise, I certainly would have done that.
Okay.
But I ran in 10. Told everyone while I was running that I was against the death penalty, even though the horrendous Pettit trials were taking place while I was running. I was prepared to lose the election based on my position on the death penalty. So to say compromise is a bad thing, I was prepared to lose the election rather than change my position with respect to the death penalty.
Subsequently,
And by the way, I was attacked for that by my opponent, and it's one of the reasons that we had a very close election.
Subsequently, you nominated Justice McDonald to be Chief Justice. The Senate, in a close vote, rejected that nomination, largely with the Republicans in opposition. They pointed, among other things, to this death penalty debate. You felt the fact that Justice McDonald would have been the first same-sex Chief Justice in the country, openly at least, that there was some pushback against that, which I know the opponents of his nomination strongly disagreed with. Do you still feel that played any significant factor in
What played any?
The fact
that he was gay?
Yes.
Absolutely.
You still okay?
Oh yeah, sure. There were 5 Republican senators who lost their Senate seats this year, and every one of them probably would have been reelected, but for that vote. People are smart. They know a bigot when they see one, and they know when they're being lied to. For instance, those same senators voted to renominate the person who wrote the decision on the death penalty. So they voted to put or continue on the bench someone who wrote the decision, but then they said, but we can't vote for this gay man who voted to do away with the death penalty. Who, by the way, every year he served in the legislature, he was on record as being against the death penalty. And he was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. There was no new factor there except, the bigoted behavior. And then there may have been other things. We now know that Judge Zarella, who left the bench, was actively working at opposing McDonald's nomination. Over the fact that he withdrew his nomination for the same job based on how he participated in inappropriate activities on the Supreme Court himself.
Yet they had many of these same senators that had affirmed his Justice McDonald's nomination as a justice. So if they were prejudiced, anti-gay, why would they have approved his appointment as a justice?
Yeah. My
point is, it sounds like that wouldn't be the motivating factor. I mean, they're anti-gay justices, but they're pro-gay justices, but anti-gay chief justices.
They could block the nomination, right? They couldn't block the nomination when it was appointed. So this was very much about people realizing that they had the ability to do that and then doing it. I mean, these are senators who told you they had an open mind, and yet in the hearing you could tell by the questioning that they had no open mind. If anyone who watched that hearing and saw Republican senators question Judge McDonald knew that their decision had already been made. And for those individuals, even on the day of the vote, to tell constituents that they hadn't made up their mind was an out-and-out lie.
It sounds like this is one of the more disappointing or upsetting political outcomes.
We got a good Supreme Court chief, somebody who I knew and was comfortable with, but I call out bad behavior, and this was bad behavior, and quite frankly, I'm happy 5 of them lost. Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you about Sandy Hook.
Sure.
How did the experience of confronting that horror, how did that change you as a governor and as a person, if it did? And are you surprised that the mass shootings we've seen again and again since then, before then and since then, hasn't result in the kind of reforms nationally that we were able to see in Connecticut.
That's a lot right in
I
there.
know,
So
take it as you take it apart as you think.
Yeah. First and foremost, my life may have been changed, but not anywhere nearly as much as people who lost their loved one, whether it was a child, their wife, or their daughter, adult daughter. It was a horrendous situation. I think it portended a reality for Americans that there is no safe place, that guns are so ubiquitous, that the influence of the NRA is so strong that they could even, by the way, play a role in changing the outcome of a presidential election. Perhaps in cahoots with the Russians. America's got a gun problem. Now, it also has other problems. It has mental health problems, and it has a violent streak problem, and it has a lack of attention to security problem. But we have a gun problem, and I dealt with my own grief and my own reactions to what happened that day, and watched the legislature not be able to do anything on guns. I watched there was an agreement, quote unquote, that anything that was going to be done on a bipartisan basis, and so the first votes of the bipartisan commission didn't pass anything because there wasn't bipartisan agreement. That's when I kicked in, quite frankly, and went on a campaign to shape what would come out of the legislature, including doing 17 town hall meetings across the state and getting yelled at by gun owners, and supported by folks who wanted more public safety. My commitment to the gun issue was clearly hardened by what I experienced at the Sandy Hook School and Firehouse, particularly. And I think Connecticut passed a great law that wasn't the only reason that we've seen the largest drop in violent crime, but is one of the reasons we've seen the largest drop in violent crime in all of the United States. And
being also on the national stage on this issue because of what happened here in Connecticut, is it cultural issues that make it so hard to take this national? And if we don't take it national, we know the guns can still across state lines and such. Why is it such a difficult fight?
Money.
Yeah.
Money and a misconstruing of the Constitution to find the granting of privileges that weren't intended. What I said on the Sunday following the Friday of the shooting on national TV is that this was going to happen in your community, anyone's community. And unfortunately, that's proven to be true. Think about a state like Florida where they've had multiple mass shootings, one in a school and one in a nightclub, and then many other smaller. The technical definition is any time more than 3 people or 4 people are injured in a shooting. We call it a mass shooting. Well, we have states that specialize in mass shootings, and we have a state that doesn't. And we have other states that don't. Massachusetts is safer, and Connecticut is safer, and states that have good gun laws and close loopholes in their states are safer. They're not as safe as they could be because we don't have good national laws. Remember that over 40% of guns change hands without a background check in the United States. That's not true in Connecticut, but people do transport those things across borders.
A lot of the challenges you dealt with are challenges within the state, though other states face a lot of the same challenges, but issues like second chance approach and gun reform, that debate takes place nationally as well. And do you see any role for yourself in these kind of national discussions after your time as governor, and what might that be?
I've actively participated in the gun discussion for the last 6 years. I've actively participated in equity issues. One of the first things, and I'm very proud of it, goes back to other issues we're talking about, is we passed transgender protections in our state in I think it was 11. So that people had rights regardless of how they identified their sexuality. We've led that discussion in the United States. We've led a lot of discussions in the United States. I don't think the people of Connecticut actually know the leadership role that Connecticut has played over the last 8 years on these issues, including, quite frankly, one that I was recognized for, and that is recognizing our obligations to play a role with the rest of the world in resettling refugees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you had that issue in 2015, I think it was, when Governor Mike Pence, then governor of Indiana, now our vice president, put a ban on taking any refugees into Indiana.
It was even worse than that, because this was not directed at Mike Pence, who was the governor of Indiana. On a Thursday afternoon, one governor, I think it was Walker, no, it was the governor of Michigan, put out a press release saying that he was not going to have his state accept any additional refugees. And within 4 days, 31 governors in total had said that. And that abrogates our laws, our treaties, our moral obligations to individuals who had supported us in the Middle East at great harm or potential harm to themselves. And so I just called it out. And it just so happens that Governor Pence, the first refugee to be resettled in the aftermath of that, was going to go to Indiana, and he rejected those people coming to his state. They came here, and they brought their child, and they are quite remarkable, as refugees are in the United States. They behave very well economically. And so this idea that we're going to have a religious barrier or a geographical barrier to playing what is, again, a moral obligation didn't make any sense to me.
Do you see that as sort of that scenario as sort of a microcosm of the debate we continue to have nationally over these issues?
We have a president who wants to demonize individuals based on their sexuality, their geography, their religion. I would even argue within our own country what part of our country they come from, all of which is abhorrent to the Constitution of the United States and how the United States has advanced itself over the last 240 years. So I don't understand the times we're in, quite frankly, but I also recognize that if people don't raise their voices about such behaviors, they're likely to become the victim of such behaviors.
Switching gears on, if you have probably the most difficult job, Joette Katz, who heads up Department of Children and Families, I might argue might have the second most difficult.
No, job. I would argue she's got the most difficult.
And she made great strides in keeping children in these situations in extended families, where before your administration, before her tenure, seeing a high amount of these children institutionalized, foster care. Yet there were some poor outcomes in some cases where things went wrong using that scenario, and her agency is still under the federal court.
Only because the legislature refused to approve a settlement.
I wanted to ask you about,
That's the only reason. They would not be under federal supervision if the legislature had agreed to do that. And quite frankly, the Republicans in the state Senate wouldn't allow it to happen. It's a mistake. But let's go back to the broader issue. I think the average tenure of a commissioner in a county or a state being in charge of children's welfare is less than 2 years. We have benefited mightily by having the same commissioner for 8 years, which has been long enough to institutionalize the kinds of changes that Commissioner Katz made. Not the least of which is the almost total elimination of out-of-state placements, where we used to have hundreds of children taken from our state and placed in facilities in other states. That doesn't happen anymore. I think in the last year we had a total of 11, and those were very specialized treatment options. So the wholesale of removal of children, not only from their home, but their city, their school district, and the like, has been largely ended. And the percentage of children, as you pointed out, placed with a family member has been greatly increased. And although bad things happen, and they are going to happen, fewer bad things happen as a result of the systemic changes that have been brought about as a result of her leadership. If governors and commissioners cut and run every time a predictable bad thing happens, that is, in children agencies across the country and across county governments, which do it in a lot of states, there are going to be bad things that happen, in part because you're dealing with a group of people who have, by their nature of being within the system, certain deficits. What's important is to have the policies in place that lead to recovery and fewer deficits, not more. And that's what Connecticut has been about doing for the last 8 years. And again, on a national basis, Connecticut is recognized for having made mighty changes. Now seen as one of the state leaders in the country on reforming how those agencies operate and interact with the group of families and children who they're supposed to be serving.
You've made reference 2 or 3 times to standing firm, not cutting and running when the heat turns up. Taking this globally, maybe pushing it a little, but we saw from the end of World War II until modern times an ascent of democracy. Democracy was the best way to govern and move things forward. But in some, you could argue now, to some extent, democracies, Western democracies, are struggling. In some cases, because so much of the focus is on the next election, on an unwillingness to compromise with the other party, to give the other party any victories, and other countries internationally are looking at other systems that maybe don't have those debates and are moving forward. So maybe it's a kind of unwieldy question, but do you see some importance for those like you and people who run for political office, to recognize the bigger goal of the public service and moving the country forward, as opposed to the political goal of positioning themselves and their party for that next election?
Well, let's take the big issue first, and then we'll go down to that which ails the United States. But listen, there are only 2 types of governments in the world. There's democratic governments, and there are totalitarian governments. There's no in between. We're only going to be a little totalitarian. You're one or the other. Either you believe in the rule of law, which I would argue our president does not, and is taking this country in the direction of a totalitarian regime, or you're committed to democracy. There is something happened in the United States, and it happened at the behest largely of the Republican Party and conservative thinkers and funders, and that is we gerrymandered the Congress of the United States so that under normal conditions, it became impossible for Democrats to have a shot at having the people's House represent the views of the time, fulfilling the mission that the founders or the writers of our Constitution envisioned. That is one House that takes a longer look and one House that takes a shorter look. And when you gerrymandered districts, you made that impossible. That empowered Republicans to become more and more radicalized and to take and to fear. The only thing, if you were in a gerrymandered Republican district, the only thing you had to fear was someone on your right, not someone on your left. And that pulled the Republican Party in the direction that ultimately led to the election of Donald Trump, which has been a total disaster for democracy. And you can argue whether he's done some good things or bad things. For democracy, and I would go back to the underpinnings of some of your questions. I think what we're seeing play itself out in some countries is actually a reaction to the American election and the possibilities of totalitarian-like rhetoric being more acceptable in those countries because it was acceptable in our country.
And how do we begin to reverse that? And,
well,
and despite these gerrymandering, we saw the Democrats take the House.
We saw them take the House, which was would never have happened, but for the mess that the president has caused and his personal behaviors and his violations of the Constitution, the emoluments clause not being the only one. We saw this very radical departure of what would otherwise have been sustained, and that is that Republicans would have maintained control. 9 million more Americans voted for a Democrat congressional representative, the highest number differentiating that's ever been experienced in our history. And yet the Congress is relatively closely divided, representing the gerrymandering that I have previously referenced. Having said that, the gerrymandering is a symptom, but also part of the illness. It's a symptom of the illness that we push ourselves further and further. The dangers of that is that both parties are being pulled further to the extremes by the presence of gerrymandering, I would argue, and that's not healthy for the United States. The Congress is someplace, Washington is someplace where people should go to get things done, and whenever possible, get them done on a bipartisan basis.
The Supreme Court so far has taken a pass on imposing some control over gerrymandering.
I think that's true. I think that it's one of the reasons that I'm so excited that Democrats elected a Democratic governor in every open or held seat by a Democrat and picked up 7 additional seats. And most of those are in states where the governor will be able to play a role in making sure that we have a fair redistricting after the next census, as opposed to what happened in this country following the 2010. But actually, they didn't even wait till 2010. In Florida and Texas, as opposed to our history, we actually had state legislators with state Republican governors change districts in between the census.
Last question. I want to come back to Connecticut.
Sure.
I said I have you for an hour. I want to keep roughly to my hour. There's been criticism that the deal you struck with the state unions, the CBEC agreement, it extended till 2027 the state union benefit contracts You got some substantial concessions, certainly from your perspective on going forward on how pensions, the state's contributions to pensions, limits and such. And I'll let you talk about that. But in return, they also received guaranteed wages and a no layoff provision, which arguably does that tie the hands of your successor? And I guess that's the criticism, that the deal unfairly ties the hands of your successor and kind of leaves him less room than maybe you even had when you had to tackle the problems.
You really shouldn't repeat all of the things that you just said, because most of them aren't true.
Okay, well, you go through them then.
well, first of all, I inherited a state that had certain protections built in for state employees that I could not undo. Although we had the ability to lay people off, but as I sit here doing this interview, the incoming governor could lay off 8,000 people.
How's that?
Because 8,000 people aren't covered by that protection. But you didn't say that in how you phrased the question. And by the way, most people have never read the CBAC 2 agreements that we negotiated. But I'll go a step further. We just last Friday released the Pew stress test on the state pension plan, and we passed. And we passed because of the changes that were made in 11 and then made in the second CBAC agreement. And by the way, if rates of return fall below a certain level, employees automatically begin contributing a higher amount. Those agreements aren't the problem. They're part of the resolution of the problem. The problem is that Republican governors and some Democratic governors gave away the store without putting any money in the storeroom. Just made benefits better, larger. And when did that stop? It stopped when I got elected. It stopped in 11, and it stopped in our second CBAC agreement. So the state is in far better condition, and any governor who takes office on the 9th of January, 12 noon, can immediately lay off 8,000 people. That's the reality. So what has been told and retold repeatedly is a lie. But if an esteemed editor is operating under that impression, then imagine how hard it is for me to have people actually understand what was accomplished in that agreement.
The 8,000 are fall outside. They're not.
They are not. They're not in unions. They're not covered by that agreement. They became employed after that agreement. We're constantly replacing a workforce. Mm-hmm. So anyone who got hired after the date of that agreement, under normal circumstances, we are replacing somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 state employees. For the foreseeable future, we're going to be replacing on a regular basis an even higher number. And by 2022, when additional aspects of the CBAC agreement kick in, we're probably going to see, between the day of the second CBAC agreement that our administration entered into and July 1st of 2022, 16,000 state employees will have left the state employment. So it is, and they will, because they don't want to be subject to different benefit packages and other requirements. CBAC doesn't stop anybody from doing anything, except it stops governors and legislators from doing stupid things, which is what they spent decades doing.
Just for the record, we editorially urge the legislature to endorse the CBAC agreement you negotiated.
I'm not picking on you, but
if I asked that question, it wouldn't get much of a response.
Yeah, no, and I understand. I'm not. Listen, I have the utmost respect for you. So, but the reality is, people in the legislature, Republicans most particularly, just anything we did was never going to be enough, right? So. We have documented, and it has been independently documented, that we cut over $40 billion in long-term obligations for the state in the 2 CBAC agreements that my administration effected. $40 billion, right? All of my predecessors from 1930 till 2011 grew those obligations. There's only one person who shrank them. One administration that shrank them. In fact, under the Rowland and Rell administration, they would give people bonuses to retire early, and that made the matters worse. The Rell administration was responsible for an additional $1.5 billion in expenditures over the next 30 years because of incentives to get people to retire. I never did an incentive for people to retire. I mean, it's just... you want to know why I'm not popular? Because I didn't do the easy things, and again, I'll go back to this. I'm incapable of doing the easy things.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming in.
Thank you.
Always interesting, Governor.
It's always. Listen. We've had some great dialogue over the years, and I do mean I have great respect for this paper, and for you, and what you all have accomplished. And I think the great fear I have about our nation going out into the future is there are too few institutions, and by that I mean newspapers, left to do the business of the people, and that is to make sure that people understand what's going on and what their leaders are doing. And the diminished capacity that we have in the United States to do real hard investigative work may be our ultimate downfall.
That's a concern we certainly share, and we'll be trying to figure it out.
Great, thanks.
Thanks again.